All right, well, that's done. So, how hard is it to actually be a security technician? Well, there's a few things that go into it.
You gotta keep all your tools stocked and your van organized with all the supplies you need.
And yeah, sometimes you're working outside in the cold and then you're inside in the warm. So you gotta wear a bunch of layers because it's a bunch of different temperatures where you're working. Yeah, sometimes you gotta carry heavy stuff. But yeah, that's nothing compared to running up 4 flights of steps or 12. Depends on the building you're in.
And sometimes you might have a heck of a lot of panels to wire up.
But is that hard? Yeah, sometimes you gotta move a ton of cable. And yeah, sure, you gotta carry a ladder around sometimes.
But do all those things mean that the job is actually hard? Well, in today's video, we're going to talk about just that. Welcome back to the Security Bros. My name is James, this is Ken. Those are just a couple examples of things that a security technician might do on a daily basis. The question is this career actually hard? Like say a oil, whatever they're called, oil well driller, the guys that work, you know, on the offshore rigs and they're slinging the chains around the things, throwing them down, oil spray, like rip dudes, right? You know, that's a hard job. Is being a security technician a hard job?
All right, there's different levels of technician, even in the security world. If you're in the fire alarm industry, the lowest level would be your inspection technicians. So in fire alarm, you'll have technicians that do nothing but put a little smoke into the air and see if the smoke sensor goes off. And so it doesn't require a lot of technical knowledge. It's basically a very easy job. It's also the lowest paid job of technicians. There would be like three levels. You got your tester, you've got your service guy, and then you've got your project person, the ones who does the actual install of the system. To me, the service technician, that's your lower level technician. And then the project installer, that's your higher level. And those guys definitely get paid more than the service technician. Well, all the companies that I used to work for, the project technicians got paid more than the service guys. But the only exception might be if it's an older service guy that's been with the company a long time, maybe he's worked up to a higher pay. But if you're just starting at a company and you're just starting out in the service section, you're not going to be worth as much as the installer of the project.
I would say service technicians for security, it's typically a bit of an easier job. You're kind of driving around to more locations throughout the day. You're just kind of going in and it's more brain power trying to figure out like what's going on, what's wrong with whatever system. So it's typically not a lot of super heavy lifting and hard work. And then your installers, it might be a little more physical, labor intensive, maybe pulling cable through ceilings or installing conduit or a little more physically intensive. I don't think it requires quite as much broad knowledge. Your service technicians are probably going to need to have a broader knowledge of multiple systems, how everything works, how everything ties together, what could be the cause of this. Oh, I've seen this happen, a couple years ago with this type of system, usually affects it this way, blah, blah. So you're working with a lot more kind of understanding to try to troubleshoot what the problem is. So it leans heavier on that. Whereas your installation, if you're pulling on new cables, you can just kind of follow the spec sheet and get everything to where you need to go. And yeah, it does require knowledge, but I would say it's a little more streamlined. But as a general rule, for the most part, I wouldn't say that being a service or installation technician is super hard. There are days when it's hard, but for the most part, it's not. You're going to have days where you're working in the cold and it's brutal outside, but you can put on extra layers, you can man up, you can deal with it. Sure, that does make the job a bit harder, but I wouldn't say it's, that makes it super hard.
Depends on the company you're working for too. The first company I worked for, like each project could potentially be an entire different manufacturer, could be an entire different setup. One job might have been a prison in New Hampshire. And so it's an out-of-town job, first of all, and then you're working on like a PLC system that integrates into custom panels with buttons and stuff to open and close doors. And the next job could be like a bank in Washington, D.C. And then our next job would be something like like a school, and the next one might be something on top of a mountain where we're having to mount like ground rods and pound them into the mountain. Like each one was so customized and different, but because of that, I was always learning something new. It wasn't like, oh gosh, I've seen this problem on another location that used this exact same system. It's like, no, this was a customized system. We had people that wrote software to integrate with these systems, like customized software just for this one client. The upside for me is that in a very short period of time, I became like really, really good as a technician because you're just constantly introduced to new things. Most companies though, you can't become successful like that for most companies. Like most companies are going to find some sort of niche and have a lot of customers that are very similar, using similar systems. And in that case, like James said, being like an installer of projects, you really only need to teach somebody how to like install the system correctly. And if they do it right, there should be very little needed on the troubleshooting side of things. They really shouldn't have to think too much because they know like, okay, this wire goes here, I connect it in this way. But it does require you to, like on every job, you have to get out a lot more tools and you have to get out more ladders, and you're going to run more cabling. You're probably going to install things like conduit that you wouldn't install as a service technician. And so it's a lot more physically demanding. And so like a lot of these technicians will tell you that they started out maybe doing projects, and as they got older, they wanted to switch to doing just service. Customer calls in and says, hey, I have a problem, my camera's not working. They send a service technician to troubleshoot. And they want to be that guy. They'll say the downside is they end up gaining a lot of weight because it's not as physically demanding. So they may not even need to get a ladder out.
A lot of guys, like you says, they get older and they've been in the industry for a while. A lot of them will be like, I just want to do service. And they've told me straight up because they can just kind of chill.
They can chill. And I've seen some of these guys, I'm like, where's your ladders? It's almost like some of them don't even have a ladder on the van.
Well, some purposely will take it. Some will like take the ladders out so they have to call somebody else to come that does have a ladder.
If you're an installation technician, you'll typically be working with project managers and like higher level people in the company that know more stuff. If you're a service technician, you're not usually working with a project manager from the office. You're working with just a dispatcher. They don't know if you're taking like too much time to do your job. So you could go, like you said, and then you could go and tell the dispatcher like, oh, well, this one's going to require a ladder, so we need to reschedule it. And the dispatcher will say like, okay. But if you, as an installer, if you go back to your project manager and say like, oh, I have to reschedule the day because I don't have, a 6-foot ladder, the guy's going to say like, what the heck? Why don't you have a ladder on your van, dude? You get away with a lot more stuff as a service tech. And it's a big problem with some of the larger companies because these technicians will go out and they don't really put that much effort into their troubleshooting because they're not even good at it, or they're just being lazy, and they'll diagnose a problem because that's what you end up doing as a service technician. You diagnose the problem, you come up with a solution. A lot of times what would happen, like at the company you used to work at, the technicians would go out and let's say a camera wasn't working, like it was a black screen. They would just make a guess. Like instead of doing really like any real troubleshooting, and they would say like, yeah, the camera needs to be replaced. Because they don't feel like getting out their tools and doing any real inspection on the system. Then they assign a return trip, they replace the camera, the problem still exists. Now, obviously, and what they're hoping is that they're not the ones that are assigned to replace the camera, but whoever goes out now is like, oh, okay, I'm replacing the camera. It doesn't work. It's still a blank screen on the monitor. And now they have to start troubleshooting. Is it the cable? Is it the connector? Is it a port on the recorder? Is it some programming glitch? Did the recorder need to be rebooted? Or like, it could be any number of things. And so now they have to go through an actual troubleshooting process. Some of the managers, they'd have their like monthly or weekly meeting. And that was a huge issue because they had all these like return calls that they can't legitimately charge customers for now. So they can't charge them for both of those visits, which means that they're having to the company has to eat the cost of like half the time being like dud time that they can't charge for. And they don't like that. A lot of these guys, they get it wrong. Sometimes 2 or 3 times in a row. Anyway, the point is like a lot of service techs can unfortunately be lazy, but a really good service technician, as you said, should be like really aware of how all these systems work and be really good at troubleshooting.
Right.
Preferably, that's what you would want in a service tech.
I think a lot of this comes down to kind of the mindset you bring to it. I would say as a general rule, being an installation technician or a service technician, neither of which are super hard, but they can have days where it is hard. So it's like generally not so much, but there are times when it does require some extra. Now, this, like you kind of mentioned before, it depends on the company you work for. You and I used to work for the same company, and they were a big fan of doing night work, after hours, weekends, out of town trips. One of these occasions, it was a big project. It was in the middle of winter. It was this huge, like continuous effort kind of thing, I think is what they would call it. And it was a bunch of conversions of a bunch of property. Basically, when you started the project, you had to work until it was done. And they were taking, what, 20 plus hours a piece? Something like that, maybe more than that.
What, each project?
Yeah, because you're fighting sleep, you're tired, you're trying to maintain mental acuity, you're trying to get, cables done, stuff in and out. You're kind of, thankfully we're mostly inside, but you're still fighting some of the cold when you're dealing with stuff. So I would say that was actually pretty hard.
Yeah, well, they turned a job that would have been difficult into a job that was like very difficult.
Oh yeah.
But if I was planning a job, we would have been done very differently.
Yeah.
Yeah. So there's such thing as like setting yourself up for success.
Oh, 100%.
Setting yourself
I'm a big
up for
believer.
most likely failure. Their management team let the customer dictate how they were going to do their job.
Right.
I do not let the customer dictate how we do our job. I don't know why some of these people jump through all these like hoops for the client. Like you can just say that's not how
You
we do
can't
it.
say no.
You,
Right.
Yeah, which
Yeah.
we do. Like it's, and then because all clients ultimately care about is how the job ends. Does it end well? And if you can prove like doing it my way has a good end result, then any decent, normal human being respects that. For instance, James here, where we're installing a camera on a ceiling tile. Generally, we'll aim to put that camera at the center of the ceiling tile just because it looks the best and it doesn't look like sloppy. I would measure it out myself to make sure I got the camera center because that's how I know I'm in the center. And then James would come with his camera and plop it right in the center and be like, well, why don't you just eyeball it? And I'm like, because if I eyeball it, it's not going to be whatever. I'm like, yours probably isn't either. So I was like, here, just try it. So he puts it in the center. I make a note of where he has the camera. I measure it perfectly center. Cool. I was like, okay, do it again. He does it with the next camera, dead center without measuring. And so I said, hey, fair enough. You managed to get it dead center doing it your way. It's faster than measuring it out and making marks and stuff. Then where do I care, right? I'm not really set on it. The only reason for asking him to do it a certain way is to get a certain result. But if he's able to get a great result doing it his way, then me, as a normal human, I'm totally fine with that. Plus, like I said, it's faster. Same thing, if you can show a client, like doing it our way ends up in a nice, smooth transition. Normal clients, unless they have a severe like mental issue, then they'll be fine with that.
Right.
What would end up happening is the customer would say like, we want this thing to be done straight through, like this over a weekend kind of a thing.
Overnight. We don't want to know you were there kind of a thing. We just want it to be done when we show back up on Monday.
But then it runs into issues because they're trying to do it too fast and cram too much into too small of a space. And then when it runs into issues, then they're concerned like, oh no, what is the client going to say? We got to get this resolved ASAP. And then of course it's not getting resolved ASAP. And then the customer is upset because like, what the heck, happened to me? It's like, why would you put yourself in a position to set yourself up? Like, why would you give yourself no margin for error? But, I wasn't the one managing it. But when I have been in a position to manage things like I am now, then we don't do it like that. And then our results are better and we set ourselves up for success.
Yeah.
For the love of God.
I would say this job probably has the potential to be more mentally taxing than physically taxing. So sometimes you can run into, maybe you're doing a big building conversion of an access control system and whatever you walked into that was existing has been serviced or messed with or just installed plain horribly back in the day, but it's just a mess of wires, right? You just got wires everywhere. And so it's your responsibility to take all that mess, put it into a new system and have the whole thing function perfect. It's not like physically hard work, but it can be a bit mentally challenging to go through that whole process and make sure that it happens on schedule, neatly, and that everything works out just fine.
That's a good point because it's sometimes difficult for humans to be both the kind of people that enjoy the rough side, like the blue collar aspect of work, right? You're carrying tools, you're doing tool work. At the same time, you need to be almost like an engineer where you have to use your brain a bit and go through like a process.
Yeah.
A lot of what technicians have to do when you're going to install something is you're replacing something else, as you said. And so you might be replacing some stuff, adding addition to the system, removing a piece of it. And so there's a few things going on.
Yeah, there's layers.
It's very rarely a completely like brand new install on a brand new building and everything's just fresh and new. That's when you need more skill as an installer.
Right. But that was, was my earlier point. If everything's just brand new, you do need knowledge and skill, but it's pretty simple.
Yeah, we can show you how to do that very quickly.
Yeah.
For like say one system.
Right.
A lot of the jobs that we do, they have an old system and we're replacing some of it, but maybe we're keeping some of the cabling, but not keeping some of this other cabling. And we're also making some additions and we're also subtracting something. And so there's a variety. And so you got to both be this guy that uses a screwdriver and wears your cargo pants and gets dirty. And at the same time, you have to be able to look at some paperwork, look at this job, kind of like, work it out and then come up with a good process. Like we'll go in and sometimes we'll say like before we disconnect anything, we need to make sure we go through and like label cables. You'll have cables that start at what we call the back end and they're like the basics, the system. And then they run out into different parts of the building. So think of like a camera system. All the cameras might connect to a recorder, but then they splinter off and they go all throughout a building. You have cables, but you don't know what, they're for cameras, but you don't know what cameras. And so maybe you test each one to figure out like, oh, this is for the front door camera. Cool, front door camera. Let me put a label on that right before you disconnect the wires. This way, when you disconnect the wires and you put in the new recorder, you kind of know where you need to plug everything in. This especially applies to other things like alarm wire, like alarm sensor wires, access control wires. This is like the lock wire for a front door. This is the card reader for front door before you disconnect them from the old system so that when you put in the new system, you can get the wires there. And in some cases, it might be like two big enclosures that the cables are located in, and they have all these little control boards all throughout these two enclosures. But the new system is maybe like 4 enclosures. And so you have to now reroute cables. And so you have to figure all that out and come up with a process to do that.
Right.
And so especially if it's like an access control system, which people are using in the building. So while you're taking this down, people are like scanning fobs and like, oh, the door's not unlocking for me, or I can't use the elevator. You have to come up with a plan of how to execute this without disrupting the whole building. Which is why some clients ask you to do it over like a weekend for an office building when they're not there, or ask you to come and do it in the middle of the night when they're not there. There are usually ways to do it where you don't have to work all those crazy hours, but you have to like come up with a process. And that's why I think you're onto a point when you say the difficulty is almost more psychological. Preferably you're like an engineer kind of a person who gets stir crazy working in like the engineering lab. You're the kind of like engineer who likes to get out, like boots on the ground. That actually is me to a great extent. I can't be in like one place too long. I get a little bit restless.
There are days when you're putting in a lot of physical effort or it's like 102 degrees outside. And like, that's hard. For the most part, you're putting in the effort, but it's not like exceptionally hard work. I would always notice the days or the weeks that were like extra hard physically. I'd be like, oh, that was like extra hard that week. That's how it as a good point. Generally wasn't too bad. But a more often thing that would pop up would be like, oh, this is mentally exhausting, or you're stressing over some project you're working on and, oh, can I meet that deadline? Oh, did I connect that thing? Did I pull all the cables I need to pull? So you're thinking, like you said, kind of the engineer mind, like you're thinking through all these different layers. How can I do this without like, pulling down the access control system so people aren't getting locked out? Or if I pull down the access control system, a bunch of people are just going to get in that shouldn't be in the building. If you're doing maybe a conversion plus an addition like you were just talking about, you got to think about what's there, what you're adding, how to do that transfer smoothly, and then how to make sure you're getting all your new pieces in place. So there's a lot that goes into it. And then if you're working with team members, you got to kind of coordinate that whole plan. The job is very challenging, but I wouldn't say as a general rule, very hard.
What I've always said is that the knowledge to actually install a system is not that much. Where the experience comes into play is all the years you spend learning what I call the ifs, ands, and buts. Well, in this situation, you're doing it, but you have to kind of put a tweak on it. Well, but in that situation, you would put the tweak on it, but because you're working with that other thing, you now have to kind of do it like this. And so these other kind of small things, but you're never going to learn all of them in like 1 year because you're not going to encounter all those scenarios in 1 year.
And there's not like a book of them either.
And so it might take you like a good 4 years or more. Like some people it might take you a decade, but like I would say in 4 years, if you're doing a lot of different jobs, you probably will encounter like 80% of them maybe. A lot of your career is spent learning the ifs, ands, and buts.
Yep.
The exceptions or whatever.
And you don't realize how many there are until you go to train somebody. I've trained some guys. It was almost daily that there was ifs, ands, and buts that came up. I'd be like, well, this is, and then they'd be like, well, what about, and like, oh, shit. Well, in this case, yeah. And you're like, really? There's this many different things that are just banging around up here? That takes years and years of being in this industry to collect your little fanny pack of ifs, ands, and buts.
If you're interested in getting into a good career, it's actually quite cool. I very much enjoy this work.
It's a lot of fun. I've been doing it for a long time now. He actually got me into it a long time. I forget what I was doing when I started working at a Office Depot or something like that when you first.
Office Depot.
Maybe a restaurant. I don't know. Might have
Office Depot and Chevy's. You were working both jobs or something.
I was rocking some servers and all that. Yeah. And the first thing that he taught me, I remember to this day, he took me to a bar and wrote on a napkin how a circuit worked.
I don't know. It's just cool work because not a lot of people do it. But the other good thing about it, if you do learn it, is that you can go to any major city in the U.S. or probably even the world, and you can get a job making average money for that area.
Yeah,
like decent money for that area. And so you have a lot of options. Whereas you might look at jobs that pay more money, but you're usually stuck to like that area that you're staying because you can't just like quit that job and go to whatever city you want to live in and definitely have a job within the first month. Whereas with this stuff that we do, if you're good at it, you can have a job within probably a week. I'll just say definitely within the first month. And a lot of people think that maybe there's not room to move up in the company, in any company that they're in. But there is definitely room to move up. A lot of people don't want to move up. And so a lot of the people who do want to move up, they look at everyone else who's not moving up and they think, oh, it's because there's not opportunity. It's like, no, a lot of people, they just enjoy doing that job and it has very low responsibility, like in terms of like low stress. A lot of times people don't realize, like I've known guys that they thought they wanted to become like management. They got into management and then they're working from the office instead of from the field. It's just a lot more stressful in the office in many cases than in the field, because in the field, you're just kind of like,
yeah. A lot of times you might be by yourself and no one's really bothering you.
I knew this guy, he went into management and he went straight back to being a technician because he found he did not enjoy being in management. But if you want to move up and you want to take on more responsibility, you want to become a project manager or you want to move up, there's absolutely opportunities for that. Maybe not at the company you're at, but there's definitely going to be a company that's looking for that.
That being said, we do need more security technicians in the industry. You can go to some colleges for it, but most of the people I know that are in the industry kind of learn on the job.
One reason that we are cautious about training new people that don't know this work, because like you said, most of the people that get these jobs, they didn't get it by getting a degree. They got it from starting as an apprentice and just like learning it on the job, which is great because you're actually getting paid while you're learning. You're getting paid something. The problem with training a lot of people is that they want to learn it, but then they don't stay in it. And so the first, let's say, year is all, from like our perspective, is all investment. Meaning, even if we were paying somebody anything, even if they were working for free, it still costs us money because they still need transportation, like a work van and tools, and we still have to take like our time to train them. Like you can get something done by yourself a lot faster than even if you had two people working with you who didn't know anything. Like if you have like 2 or 3 people and you think, oh, well, but he's got all these people, like he can show them something and it'll like get done faster. Like somehow it just doesn't. One really experienced guy gets way more done than like a bunch of newbies. So the first year, it's all really at a loss. And so that's why a lot of companies, while they would have no problem training somebody, what they don't want to do is train somebody that doesn't even end up staying in the industry. Let's say we bring someone on, they learn for a year and they leave and they go to another company. That would be okay. What you don't want to be is the company that trains everybody, and then those people leave and go to just other industries. So that's the trouble. If you're ever thinking like, well, I've applied to these companies and nobody will give me a chance. In any case, if you enjoyed this episode, like it so we know, and share it to your friends now.
Bye.